And that, I strongly suspect, is the fundamental root cause of all autoimmunity. That you get perforated gut, which is the common name, and then you get molecules entering into the bloodstream that are not supposed to enter the bloodstream, and they would normally be kept out by the endothelial defense. And these things can then attach to our cells and then are attacked by our own immune cells. And that's what it is.
Welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. I'm your host, Lee Brandon. This work started for me several decades ago when I started to see the impact I could make on people, helping them to identify the root cause of their health problems that no doctor could figure out, including serious back, knee, shoulder and neck injuries, acne and eczema issues, severe gut health problems, even helping couples get pregnant after several IVF treatments had failed. And it really moves me to be able to help people in this way. And that is why I do what I do and why we have this show. In today's episode, I'm delighted to bring you an insightful conversation with Ben Hunt, a passionate advocate for ancestral health and the carnivore diet. We dive deep into the connections between arthritis, autoimmunity, and dietary choices, particularly focusing on how the carnivore diet can play a transformative role in managing and even reversing these chronic conditions. Ben shares his personal journey and how shifting to a carnivore lifestyle changed his life. We explore the science behind autoimmunity, the impact of modern diets on chronic inflammation, and why eliminating plant-based foods can sometimes be the key to healing. Whether you're struggling with arthritis or simply curious about alternative dietary approaches to health, this episode is packed with valuable insights. So without further ado, let's jump into this compelling discussion with Ben Hunt. Ben Hunt, welcome to the Radical Health Rebel podcast. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Ben. And to kick things off, could you share a little bit about perhaps your own background, including your educational and professional background, and what inspired you to become interested in human health and happiness?
Yeah, brilliant question. I think, professional is probably stretching it a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, background, I've lived all over. I've done a lot of different things. Lived in different places around the country. Right now, I'm in the north of Scotland, so I just moved up from England this year. I went to boarding school for a few years. I'd studied modern languages. I've studied art. I've studied history. All kinds of. But basically, one of these people that's interested in a lot of different things. And then in the mid '90s, I got into web design. So I've been in web design, online marketing, and IT generally on and off for most of the last 30 years. But looking back, it seems as though when I try and make sense of all the different various things that I've been interested in and involved with, if there's a theme, then it seems to have been me trying to work out the answer to this question, which is, how are we meant to live? How are human beings supposed to enjoy life, be happy, be healthy, walking free upon the earth? And that's taken me down so many different avenues of inquiry. Like I about 12 years ago, I moved into a large house with 2 acres of garden, and like so many people at the time, I was convinced that that carbon dioxide was a pollutant. It's worth saying I've since done a 180 on that. I think I now believe that the human caused anthropogenic climate change narrative is bogus. Okay. But at the time, my first Hotmail address ever, like in the 90s, was Eco Freak UK. I was a proper devotee. So I came up with this fantastic idea that surely soil is made out of largely carbon. So if we could find ways to build more soil, we could suck some of this evil CO2 out of the air. And as it turns out, I wasn't the first person to have that idea. And I started looking into no-dig gardening, permaculture, and that took me to started attending like seminars and conferences like the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which is a great event. and other events run by like the Sustainable Food Trust and so on, and the Ethical Farming Conference. And I started hearing some new and surprising things. People were talking about not only, which put me on the back foot, not only that ruminant animals were very important for the land, which was a novelty, because like everyone else, I was thinking, cows and sheep and stuff are evil, but also that the meat of these animals was essential for human health. And people were talking about things like DHA and EPA and CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, and this came as a bit of a surprise, because like every other sensible, well-educated, rational human being, I knew that meat was a probable carcinogen and we should limit it. And certainly the fat, full of saturated fats from meat, should be avoided, because that, like everybody knows, was the major cause of heart disease. So I started looking into this and realized that there were groups of people who ate only meat and fat from animals. And the more I looked into it, the more it made sense, because I'm a rational person. And generally I will look to nature, I will look to the evidence of my senses, and I will look to our ancestry for answers in all kinds of areas. How are we meant to live? How are we meant to be healthy? And I do believe that our ancestral past gives us most of the answers that we need. And yeah, clearly my ancestors, because I'm a white fella, my ancestors survived the last ice age, like tens and tens of thousands of years in Northern Europe, where what else were they going to eat throughout for most of the year but the fat, the meat and the fat of large animals? So yeah, and that got me in touch with Phil Escott, whom I know you've also interviewed. Yeah, and I tried it, because you got to try stuff for yourself and see what works. N equals 1. And yeah, I became convinced that the keto, paleo, carnivore lifestyle was helpful, and I've been following that now for 4 or 5 years.
So I guess it was quite a big question that got you into health, really. You were saying what's the way that human beings should really live, right? And that's kind of led you down to the road of, what's the healthiest way for people to live. And it's quite interesting when you research health and you follow let's just say authority guidelines, it almost seems like everything they recommend has a detrimental effect on your health, and everything they say you should avoid is things that actually add to your health. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think if there's one golden rule, then see what the orthodox advice is and do the exact opposite, is probably your safest starting point. It's a struggle to think of any exception to that rule, really.
Yeah,
certainly with dietary advice. I mean, dietary advice was, there's a lot of people who consider themselves, awakened to the BS that's around in the world right now. And but really, for me, realizing that the national dietary guidelines were completely upside down and the opposite of what we should be doing, you can't be faced with that kind of knowledge without it creating a domino effect of, you go, well, Christ, what else are they lying to us about? If this is so patently obvious to anybody with a brain and anyone who trusts the evidence of your own senses, what else can they be lying to us about? And once you even dare to ask that question, then that then leads on to a lot more questions and not necessarily so many answers. But it's okay.
Yeah. Something that I'd like to get your opinion on. I think I have heard you speak about this before, so hopefully I'm not asking you a question that you've not thought about the answer to before. But so in my work as a health coach, functional medicine practitioner, whatever label you want to put on me, sometimes for some people I'll do stool testing. So I'll see, what their gut microbiome, we get an idea of what's going on in their gut microbiome. And, it's still very relatively new science, if you can use the word science, if we're talking about the microbiome. But what tends to be, I guess, I'm not going to use the word consensus because I think there is a consensus, but it seems to be that the majority of research, let's call it, and the majority of experts tend to say that, in order to have a good, balanced, diverse microbiome that obviously has multiple benefits, what we need to do is to make sure that we're eating a lot of fiber in the diet, because that fiber feeds the good bacteria, in inverted commas. That helps to create things like short chain fatty acids, which has, lots of beneficial effects like boosting the immune system and securing the mucosal barrier in the gut and all these kind of things, right? And then they also say, if you eat a high fat diet, what that will tend to do, you'll end up with a higher proportion of the so-called bad bacteria, right? And you'll have a dysbiosis in your gut, and that can lead to potentially detrimental effects. So it's quite a big build up to my question, but what would you say? What would be your views on what I would consider to be the kind of consensus in research and amongst experts with regards to the gut microbiome? Because I'm pretty sure I've heard you say something very different to that. Have you ever struggled with pain that just won't go away, no matter how much you train or rest? Fred came to me with a mix of chronic pain in his wrist, back, and leg from years of running, along with concerns about a skin condition that he wanted to address through diet. He was also worried about the time commitment given his busy work and family life. But after sitting down together and creating a tailored plan, everything started to change. We crafted a diet and workout routine that fit his needs, and I adjusted the program along the way to make sure it was aligned with his schedule and goals. I made sure to be flexible, supporting him in every way, from coaching and teaching to motivating and offering guidance that went well beyond fitness. The result? Well, Fred's pain is gone and his workouts have been completely revamped. He's now incorporating everything he learned with me into his training, and he even returned for ART therapy to fine-tune his recovery. Most importantly, he now considers me part of his overall health support system. If you're ready to experience a holistic approach to improving your health, fitness, and well-being, reach out today for a consultation at www.bodycheck.co.uk, and let's create a plan that works for you.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, I'm not a medical expert, and I'm not really a health expert either. I do trust nature. And I trust common sense, and I'm, in some ways, relatively simple human being. There's a lot in the question to unpack. Okay, so where to begin? First of all, the diversity question. So, going by the evolutionary argument that human beings evolved a few million years ago, say between 2 and 3 million years ago, from a mainly plant-eating ancestor, possibly Australopithecus, right? There is no question that we have the ability to ferment some plant matter in our large intestine and to extract some short-chain fatty acids, like you say, from that process. We don't have the ability, like a cow does, or a gorilla, or a horse, to ferment enough plant matter to extract all of the fatty acids that we need in order to be healthy. So, something that a lot of people probably don't know is that to my knowledge, all large mammals on Earth persist on a high-fat diet, right? So a cow doesn't digest grass, okay? She ingests grass. And because a cow is a ruminant, so it's got these extra chambers, very large chambers in her digestive system that come before the stomach. And they host trillions of bacteria. There are no vertebrates in the entire animal kingdom, anywhere in the animal kingdom, that have the ability to break down cellulose. So cellulose is a carbohydrate. Which means it's basically made up of lots and lots of sugar molecules joined together. Okay, so whereas like starch is the plant kingdom's energy storage of choice, because when starch is good when you're not restricted for really space and weight, right? Because the problem with protein and carbohydrate is you only get 4 grams of energy, 4 kilocalories of energy per gram.
Yeah.
Whereas fat in throughout all of nature, fat is far more energy dense and efficient because you get 9 kilocalories per gram. Okay. And this is why, so I'm probably going to range all over with this. So, please bear with me and pull me back on track if you need to, but there's so much in this. Okay. So, the plant kingdom uses fats. But it also uses carbohydrates. So it'll use starch for energy storage for situations, for example, where it's not really limited by space or weight. And the thing you'll notice about plants is that they don't move around very much compared to animals. Animals are mobile. So animals have to carry their energy supplies with them if they need them. Now we'll come back to that. So let's say, for example, a tuber like a yam or a potato. Okay, it's not really limited to space under the ground, so it can make those tubers as big as it wants to, right? To store as much energy as it can, and so it does it very, very quickly in the form of starch. Then it can reuse the starch later on, etc. Or you've got bamboo, you've got palm trees, heart of palm, lots of starch. So, the plant kingdom uses a lot of starch. It will also use fats for when space and weight are a premium. Okay, so where will it use it? It will use it in reproduction. In fact, reproduction in plants and reproduction in animals is very, very fat. You'll find a lot of fat there. So you'll find fats like, lots of omega-6 fatty acids, for example, in the seeds and the nuts of plants. Why? Because that tiny thing, because every organism, if it reproduces sexually, it needs to make smaller versions of itself that then need to move away from the parent and then need to survive. So in order to survive, it needs a kickstart with some energy stores, and that comes in the form of fat. It's the same with animals, with mammals. Breast milk is full of fat because it's the best way to get lots and lots of energy in. So you tend to find fats in seeds and in nuts as well. So a cow, although it ingests lots of cellulose, so starch is lots of glucose molecules joined together with relatively loose bonds. Cellulose is also lots and lots of glucose molecules joined together, but with much tougher bonds that cannot be broken down by any vertebrate. The only things that can do it are things like fungi, nature's great decomposers, and bacteria and archaea and other kind of protozoa that can do that. So a cow ingests grass but doesn't digest grass. The bacteria break down the cellulose into its individual glucose molecules. They then feast on the sugar solution, on the glucose. They then excrete short chain volatile fatty acids, the really good stuff, saturated fatty acids like capric, caprylic, stearic acid, and that is what the cow digests in order to get her energy. And where does her protein come from? Because there's not much protein in grass either. So although there is obviously some protein in pretty much anything you can eat, she gets her protein from the dead bodies of the bacteria as well. So a gorilla, on the other hand, is a hindgut digester. It doesn't have these extra chambers before the stomach. It has a large cecum, which is pretty much the size of my forearm, and it has a huge, voluminous large intestine. We have a relatively very small large intestine with not much volume in it. So in the case of the human, I think something like 70% of the volume of our digestive system is in the small intestine and 30 in the large. For a gorilla, orangutan, other hindgut digesters, it's reversed. It's only 30% in the small intestine, which is where you digest things like amino acids and fatty acids. And they have a much, much large intestine because that's where they hold the enormous quantity of bacteria that are required then to ferment the the plant matter, the cellulose, down into its component parts that the animal can then digest. So back to the humans, we have a very limited ability to do that. And I think it's worth mentioning that the diversity, the flavor, the makeup of your gut biome is going to be largely dictated by the food that you eat. So if you eat a lot of plants, then you will be favoring the bacteria species that work on plants. But if you don't eat plants, you're favoring the other types of bacteria. So it's this idea of diversity, I think, is a massive red herring, because you don't need a large quantity of plant digesting bacteria unless you eat large quantities of plants. And likewise, you don't need large quantities of meat digesting bacteria. But the idea that that carnivores don't have a diverse microbiome is actually nonsense. They've tested it. It's just different, right? So, and also then back to what you mentioned about the fatty acids that are generated by those bacteria in the gut. We simply don't need to do that, because that is not where we get our energy from, right? We can digest, we can consume fats. Animal fats are the best for us because they contain the right proportions if the animal has fed on a natural diet anyway. Obviously, feedlot cows, if they're being fed on grain and soy and stuff like that, will have more omega-6s than we need. In the wild, we would get between 1-to-1 and 1-to-2 omega-3s to omega-6s, which is what we need, right? We don't need much omega-6 at all. So anyway, yeah, I think I've more or less. So the point is, that is not our major source of nutrition like it is in the gorilla. We don't need to get our fats from that source. Plus, we can get the like beta hydroxybutyrate, right? We can feed those endothelial cells from the bloodstream. We don't need to feed them from within the gut itself. But it always makes me laugh when you get vegans arguing that meat rots in your gut, because it just doesn't. It's converted into a fatty acid amino acid soup by the time it leaves the acidic stomach, and it's largely digested in the small intestine, leaving the large intestine's main job just to recapture water and salts and a few other things. What does actually rot in your colon is plant matter. I mean, that is how a gorilla gets its energy and its protein and everything. But we simply don't need to do it. I think that's the question.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the book Biochemical Individuality by Roger Williams?
No, I'm not. But just to go back to a point you said, I mean, like, I got into all of this because of my fascination with soil and actually with growing plants, right? So I designed and built my own greenhouse. It was a semi-earth sheltered greenhouse in my garden back in England. And I read a couple of amazing books by Dr. Elaine Ingham, like Teeming with Microbes, for example. And it's fascinating that we are just discovering the complexity of soil in parallel with other researchers in health who are discovering the incredible mind-bending complexity of the gut biome as well. But no, I'm not familiar with that one. I am familiar with the work of Natasha Campbell McBride and GAPS. And yeah, her books, Gut and Psychology Syndrome, or the more recent Gut and Physiology Syndrome, will really open your eyes to what's in there. We kind of have this image that your intestine is this kind of smooth, clean, pink tube that stuff just comes through and out. But the reality is that it's coated with this kind of mucosal slime, this almost like a soil of its own that intermingles with all the food that goes in there. So it's not a clean, smooth environment in there by any means. It's incredibly rich.
Yeah. The the book I was referring to, Biochemical Individuality. So I think it was first published in 1953. And what Dr. Williams was showing was that within human beings, all of our internal organs are completely different from each other, right? And, some people's heart might be slightly on the left, some people's are in the middle, some people might be slightly on the right.
Yeah.
And then he showed pictures of people's livers and the shapes and how they were all completely different. But what he also showed is that people whose ancestry came from, far north of the planet, their digestive tract was 50% shorter than those that were from the equator.
Wow. Never heard that. Mm.
So let me ask you a question. Why do you think that might be?
Well, the simple answer would be that they've evolved to get most, if not all, of their nutrition from fatty meat.
Mm.
Because you simply don't need such a long, particularly the large intestine for that. It's, carnivores have shorter digestive tract. That is truth. It's like, can be like twice the length of your body. Whereas, they even a pig's digestive tract is something like 7.5 meters, where, humans can be as short as like 1.5, 2 meters. Yeah. A pig is a true omnivore. Yeah. So yeah, it does make sense, and I am aware that there will be people whose genetic origin is more equatorial, do seem to have a greater tolerance for carbohydrate and fruit and things like that. So I'm not here to say that that meat and fat are the only completely appropriate foods for human. I do genuinely believe that. Well, I mean, obviously, we should all test out on ourselves what works and what doesn't. But I do think that it's like the lowest common denominator. Fatty meat, we all have the ability to consume fatty meat and fatty fish and shellfish. Beyond that is over to you as an individual. Test for yourself what works.
Yeah. I mean, I know you're familiar with the work of Weston A. Price.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And what he found when he traveled the world back in the 20s and 30s was that, people would eat whatever was in their own environment and they would thrive on that. And obviously, people living in Alaska or the Shetland Isles would eat very differently from someone who's in, middle of India or, middle of Africa, right? Because they're living in very different environments. Now, the way that I've been working in the last 20 years is using something called metabolic typing. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Not really.
Okay, so really it's a continuation of the work of Weston A. Price, and then there was Francis Marion Pottinger, and there was people like Royal Lee, George Watson, William Kelly, and then William Walcott, who is I guess you'd call him was leading expert in metabolic typing, who trained me in metabolic typing. And it's really a way of finding out what is the right diet for you, specifically in terms of your ratios of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And Bill basically says it's pretty much, down to how much carbohydrate you need and how much fat you need. Right. And so I take people through a process, adjusting their ratios until they hit what we call the sweet spot. Now, the overwhelming majority of people that I've worked with, and it might be because I live in a relatively cold country, but I would say a good 80, 90% plus they thrive when they're eating a predominantly animal-based diet with a little bit of plant-based foods in their diet. Sometimes I'll get someone who's a little bit more kind of 50-50. Now, it's nearly always females. I can't remember a male being like that. And quite often they do have some kind of Asian origin, where obviously their ancestors probably would have had, more plant-based foods available to them. So their DNA would have evolved to be eating more plant-based foods. So it's been quite fascinating for me to see that. And now obviously, what's becoming very popular, I say popular, it's been talked about a lot is, the carnivore kind of movement, which, I know a lot of people have got a lot of benefit from. And it's interesting that just last week, I think it was, I was listening to some training from a lab, it's functional medicine type training. And there was this expert, I can't even remember his name now, but anyway, he was talking about all these disastrous diets like keto and carnivore. And he was kind of saying, oh my God, how ridiculous can anyone be to even consider eating a diet like that, right? So he was talking about the gut microbiome. And I was kind of thinking to myself, you've obviously not ever spoken to someone who suffered terribly with like arthritis or an autoimmune condition. And as they start cutting plant-based foods out of their diet, they start getting better and better and better. And then eventually they get to the point where all they're eating is meat or maybe fish, maybe eggs, and all their symptoms have gone.
Yep.
But yet when they were eating plants, their life was almost not worth living because they were in such a bad condition, So I think it's, this is why I've got an open mind. I'm willing to hear different things, I mean, I've had someone on this podcast, Leilani Dowding. She's quite well known here in the UK. She's a vegetarian, been a vegetarian a very long time. And you look at her and you think, she looks really healthy. She looks really healthy, and she doesn't have any health issues. But her mother's from Southeast Asia, right? So there's a chance that genetically, she's more able to handle a diet like that. But then I've spoken to so many vegetarians and vegans, and again, I'm not knocking it. People can do what they want. But so many of them have serious health conditions, many of them cancer. That's something I'm seeing very, very regularly, is people that, particularly vegans, end up with cancer. And it's quite interesting because, again, I've had someone on this podcast who was a vegetarian, had gone through cancer, and was telling me I need to stop eating meat because I'm going to get colon cancer if I don't.
Well, there's no evidence for that anyway. Yeah, the WHO recommendations are based on complete fantasy.
Yeah. And I tried to have that conversation with her, but she just wasn't willing to hear it, right?
Because... Yeah, it is a radical shift in thinking, for sure. I mean, we've known for 100 years with the work of Otto Warburg that the majority of cancer cells, not every single one, but the majority of cancer cells, because they've got these dysfunctional mitochondria, cannot generate energy, cannot generate ATP and for energy through the normal means, and have to revert to this very, very ancient form of energy production via fermentation, which requires glucose. So the majority of cancer cells cannot survive without glucose. And we know that the healthy human body should have around 4 grams of glucose in the entire bloodstream at any time, which your liver and other organs can make through gluconeogenesis. So it's well known. It's a biological fact that having more than 4 grams of glucose in your bloodstream is toxic. So why the hell doctors say to type 2 diabetics, manage your carbohydrate intake? Type 2 diabetes is a reaction against too much glucose in the blood. So just cut out the carbohydrate. It's really simple. But yeah, and of course the other thing as well is that plants come loaded with defensive chemicals. Yeah, plants are toxic. Every single known species of plant in the world is toxic to something. The fact that we have the ability to consume a very small number of species, probably less than 1% of all the plant species on Earth that we can consume, and we really only humans get the majority of their calories that we derive from plants from about 24 different species. It's a very, very narrow range, but the range of toxins that plants have, because plants cannot run away, they can't fight, they can't burrow or fly or swim or whatever, they are restricted to static defense mechanisms. So many of them will use spines and thorns, etc. Many of them will develop furry stems and furry leaves in order to make them unpalatable to eat. But by far, the majority of plants' defenses are chemical. And that's why we get all... Now, there are some toxins, some poisons that can actually have a hormetic or beneficial effect in small quantities, for sure. And we've been using those for at least hundreds of thousands of years as medicine. So I'm not saying for a moment that no plant should ever go in your mouth whatsoever. But even if you think there's all kinds. There's the cyanogenic glycosides there's furocoumarins. There's things that will blister your skin, in contact with sunlight. But even like the main ones, things like tannins, for example. Tannins are found in 100% of plant species that we found so far. Yeah, and tannins are there as toxins, right? The same with lectins. Lectins is this big group. There's about 100 known lectins, I think, so far, and they're glycoproteins. So they're proteins that have a carbohydrate kind of arm on them that can attach to other carbohydrates. So what that means is that they can theoretically attach to animal cells. And that, I strongly suspect, is the fundamental root cause of all autoimmunity.
Did you know that 92% of people fail to follow through on their New Year's resolutions? That's right. Year after year, most of us start strong and then lose momentum by February. Sound familiar? But what if this year could be different? What if you finally had the tools to make your goals stick? Introducing Stickability, a simple, effective, and affordable program designed to help you overcome the cycle of failed resolutions. In just a short time, you'll learn how to create lasting habits without wasting hours or breaking the bank. This isn't just another plan. It's the solution to finally sticking to your healthy lifestyle goals. Don't let this year be like the last. Head over to stickabilitycourse.com now to enroll. It's affordable, easy to follow, and packed with tools to make 2025 the year that you have the ability to make it stick.
That you get perforated gut, which is the common name, and then you get molecules entering into the bloodstream that are not supposed to enter the bloodstream, and they would normally be kept out by the endothelial defense. And these things can then attach to our cells and then are attacked by our own immune cells. And that's what it is. It's not your body. I'm a huge believer in nature, as I've said before. And the idea that your body just spontaneously attacks itself is absolute bollocks. It really is. The idea that cancer cells just happen. Now, to be clear, I believe that all of us are growing cancer cells every single day. Right. And I believe that the majority of the time, all those cancer cells are mopped up, cleaned away, particularly if you have longer stretches in your day when you're not filling your face with food. And your body can afford that time to clean up, break down, or whatever. And when you're getting good sleep as well, all of which will be disrupted by blue light at night and stuff. So yeah, I'm sure. Look, we all get cancer cells, and we normally mop them up and dispose of them, and that's fine. But there's so many toxins in there. The lectins, again, lectins found in every single known plant species that there is. Yeah. So I do believe, and I think Anthony Chaffee's doing great work on this as well. Really, with his Plants Are Trying to Kill You, stuff, and he's got a book coming out as well, I believe. I think our whole thinking about plants is we've got this idea that's been implanted in our minds from a very early age that plants are naturally healthy. Bullshit. Plants don't want to die any more than an animal wants to die, and they are going to fight to the death to prevent it as well. Plants get predated and they can't move, So they come up with all of these different chemicals. The number of people who die every year just from eating things like cassava cassava is like the primary nutrient staple food for almost 1 billion people in the world, something like 700 million people, and it's got cyanide in it. You know, and the bitter cassava particularly has to be very carefully processed in order to get that out. That people die every year from eating potatoes. You leave a potato if the skin goes green or it starts to sprout, you have to cut that stuff off very carefully, because they contain nasty toxins as well. You know, where the tomato originated in Mesoamerica, Middle America, and back then they would carefully allow it to ripen on the vine, by the way. So because they're in the case of a lot of fruits, they're very toxic when they're unripe, and but so to prevent them from being consumed before they're ready, before the seeds have matured. Because the thing about fruits is that plants actually want the fruits to be eaten. That's why they put sugar in them. But they don't want them to be eaten at the wrong times until they're ripe. So what will happen is, because also you have to remember that the making poisons like this is metabolically expensive, right? Chemically expensive. So they do it very carefully. You know, they'll put like the poisons on the skin, for example, of a tuber or a fruit. That's why you get these the chemicals, for example, on a lime. And some people will have, say, a margarita in the sunshine. The juice from the lime will get on their skin. They'll get blisters on the skin, right? That's because of the chemicals that are in the skin. They're just the surface few cells of the lime fruit. But they'll be toxic while the fruit is unripe, and then they'll recycle the toxins once the fruit is ripe because they want it to be eaten then. We've got a problem now where they pick these little tomatoes like on the vine, but they ripen them artificially, not while they're detached from the plant. So they'll go red and they'll go sweet, but it actually breaks the cycle. So the toxins will still be there present in those ripe. So you have to look, they have to be ripened. Yeah, they actually have to be ripened on the plant. So be careful if it says vine ripened. Interesting one. Yeah, so it's a whole world, man. It's a whole world once you get into the plant toxins. And I think that the evidence in favor of a meat-based diet is becoming overwhelming now. If you look on Google Trends as well, look at the relative popularity of vegan diet versus carnivore diet, and even but no, just leave it at that one. But carnivore diet has been growing and growing and growing every year, right? Whereas vegan diet is very much on the decline, and the reason is that people's experience, all those useless anecdotes are piling up. So what I'm saying is, I really think that our perception of plants being naturally the healthy option compared to meat is naturally going to be challenged over the coming years. And here's another thing as well. So plants are experts in self-defense through the use of chemical toxins, right? Now, there are a lot of animals that eat plants, right? But actually a minority. There's far more carnivorous animals than there are. About 70%, 65 to 70% of all known animal species are carnivores, right? And there's a good reason, because getting your food, getting your nourishment and your energy from plants is bloody hard, right? So plants are specialized in self-defense using chemical weapons, right? So eating plants is just as specialized a skill as being a plant. So what you have is you have species but at the same time, nature will always, whenever there is an abundant resource, right? Whenever there is a source of calories, energy, nutrition, whatever, something in nature is going to try and take advantage of it. That's the law. That's natural law. So when you've got a load of grass or a load of bamboo or whatever, load of eucalyptus, we can't eat eucalyptus leaves, right? The koala eats nothing but eucalyptus leaves. Okay. So that something will evolve to recycle the energy and the nutrients from any abundant resource. We can't eat grass. Rabbits eat grass. Sheep eat grass. Okay. Now, so what happens is that the herbivorous animal co-evolves along with the relative, respective plant species, but they evolve the means to detoxify the food that they eat. Okay. And it might be through fermentation, for example, which is why fermented soya is less unhealthy for us than raw soya. That's why they eat tofu in Southeast Asia, right? And then they just don't eat raw soybeans. So, but what happens is the herbivore then removes the toxins, whatever they are, and soy has got a lot of different toxins on it, by the way, not just the phytoestrogen, lots of different toxins in soy. But so what does the herbivorous animal do, right? It takes those chemicals out. It then ejects those chemicals through its feces or urine or whatever. And it then builds its own muscle, organs, bones, fat out of the clean stuff that it actually wants. And that's why there's almost no poisonous animal in the world. There's almost nothing out there. There's the pufferfish. Right, so if you eat fugu in Japan, you have to make sure it's been prepared because there's a gland in the pufferfish that is poisonous if ingested. But there's almost nothing in the animal kingdom. We can eat at least 99% of animals in the world safely. Mm-hmm. We cannot eat 99% of plants. Mm-hmm. We can eat maybe one and get away with it. So that's why there are so many more carnivorous species of animal than there are herbivorous, because eating plants is bloody hard. So, and the idea that we can just run around in nature filling our face with any kind of plant that you come across is just ludicrous. Mm-hmm. I've taught bushcraft in the past, and so I've studied survival. There's a general rule in survival that if it doesn't move, don't eat it. So if you come across a dead animal, you don't eat it, and if you come across a plant, you don't eat it. You come across any berries, right? You just don't, unless you are 100% sure of the identification of that fruit and that it's healthy. You absolutely avoid that stuff.
Yeah. It's interesting that the one plant toxin you didn't mention was oxalates.
Oh, well,
which is another big one, and I did a whole episode on those with Sally Norton.
Yeah.
Who wrote the books Toxic Superfoods. So if anyone hasn't listened to that episode, go and check it out.
Yeah. Interestingly, when I switched to high fat, low carb diet, that was the only period in my life where I've suffered from gout, which is an extremely distressing chronic condition. It's a type of arthritis, essentially. And I believe, my personal view is that was caused by a couple of things. One is too much consumption of beer, which kind of triggered it, but also then oxalate dumping. I think that all my tissues, my bones, my organs, all the tissues in my body were then going, oh, you've stopped eating oxalates. Great. We can start dumping oxalates out. And that went on for between 2 and 3 years. I had multiple gout attacks and they have just completely stopped. Right. And that is what the carnivorous docs, like Dr. Berry, Dr. Baker, Dr. Rob Sivers, and I've researched all of that. They all say, just stick with the program. Couple of years, it'll go away. It won't come back, and it doesn't. And I do believe that's oxalates.
Yeah. It's a very, very interesting subject. So you mentioned, you switched to a, kind of high animal based, low vegetable. Do you actually eat vegetables, or are you carnivore?
I'm mostly carnivore. I believe, again, I go back, Lee, to the natural model, right? Mm-hmm. Like I say, meat and fat are the common denominator. Everyone can get away with meat and fat unless you've got, whatever that disease is that they get from the ticks that make you allergic to red meat, the Lone Star tick thing. But I do believe that ancestrally that we would have eaten Well, we would have got our nutrition from wherever we could get it. Okay.
Mm.
So, and also another interesting thing, we kind of have this idea that, yeah, there were ice ages. So there were ice sheets covering Northern Europe, for example. But meanwhile, in the tropics, it was lovely and people just ran around pulling fruit off trees all the time. The reality is actually what we know about, what we believe about the ice ages is that because in the ice ages, there was so much fresh water locked up in those ice sheets that the tropics actually became more dry during an ice age. So, what we think of as tropical in this pleasant interglacial period that we're in now, but it even, was not the case during the ice ages either. So it would have still have been a primarily animal-based diet in there. Because even fruits aren't that easy to eat. Plus, of course, you've got the issue that the modern fruits have been hybridized to maximize the sugar content. Even if you look at something like a chimpanzee, a chimpanzee is technically, according to our classification, a frugivore. So it's primarily a fruit eater. But the fruits that a chimpanzee, they're not eating bananas from Tesco, like 70% carbohydrate. The fruits that the chimp also gets the majority of its energy, not from glucose and fructose from the fruit itself, but from these fruits are fibrous. So again, it will get some energy from sugars. But again, the majority of it is coming through the bacterial fermentation of cellulose in those fruits.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the other thing about chimpanzees as well is that they also do hunt occasionally as well, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's their little treat, isn't it?
And there's loads of evidence of so-called herbivorous animals that will, you look up, you see pictures of horses, of goats, sheep, whatever, chicken walks past with her, chicks come by. If a herbivore can snatch up a chick as it passes, it absolutely will. Because there's no question there is more nutrition in chewing up an animal than that it would get from an hour's grazing. So it's always going to do it, and it's bioavailable. They will get the nutrition out of that thing. It's just that they're specialized in different ways. And large herbivores, well, the largest animals on land are herbivorous, and the reason for that is because to become a large animal, you need a huge abundance of food, and being a very large hunter is extremely difficult unless there are there's an abundance of very large herbivores around to feast on. So maybe your T-Rex, got away with it because there was, but we don't know exactly what the environment looked like 65 or more million years ago. But yeah, that's another interesting topic. There's a whole different area.
Yeah. If we look back in history, well, not that far, industrialized history. Most people, I'm guessing from my own kind of studying, most people would have passed away either due to malnourishment. Certainly, those living in industrialized areas, either from malnourishment or toxicity of some sort. Some people would call it infectious disease. I'm not in that camp. I think people were dying of toxins rather than an infectious disease, but that's a whole nother podcast. Obviously that doesn't happen now, right? These what we call infectious disease is pretty much gone now, and we won't talk about why people think they've gone. But why do you think we're living in such a epidemic of chronic disease now? Because that's never really, as far as we know, that's never really existed before. But now it seems that the majority, certainly of the Western world, is suffering terribly from some sort of chronic disease. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the big question. That is the elephant in the room when it comes to public health. So I agree with Dr. Chafee. I think that it's twofold. I think it's malnutrition, lack of nutrition, combined with toxicity from eating plants. And what's interesting, I mean, we know, for example, you can look this up. You can look up the Boston death report from 1812, in the year 1812, in the town, as it was, of Boston, Massachusetts, in America. They listed all the causes of death, and there was something like 924 deaths or whatever that year, of which 5 were from cancer. Now we're told that cancer is the number 2 killer after coronary heart disease. There was not one death from heart attack in 1812 in Boston. The first documented heart attack from by autopsy in the US was around 1900. Right? It literally didn't exist. And by the way, we weren't stupider in the 19th century than we are now. It's probably more likely the other way around. So what do I think it is? I think that, I mean, you mentioned Weston A. Price before. He was in a unique position in the 1920s and 30s to observe firsthand the impact of the export of industrially processed crop-based foods to all around the world. Right? So people were switching from their indigenous diet. Now, I should add as well at this point that we need to be very careful when we look at traditional diets. So I'll talk about like traditional or historical diets. We're still talking about the Holocene, this current interglacial period, right? Because we had the end of the last ice age about 10 to 12,000 years ago, and we had to switch primarily to agriculture. There's a few pockets of people that didn't, like the Maasai, for example, and the Inuit and the Sami reindeer herders and the Finns and whatever around the world. But a lot of people moved to agriculture. Okay, so but these aren't our ancestral diets. These are traditional diets that have only been around the last few thousand or few hundred years. People talk, for example, about there's a group of people called the Tukasenta in Papua New Guinea who get, well, and they say, well, look, they're relatively healthy. They get 90% of their calories from a few species of sweet potato, right? So therefore, humans are fine on that. Yeah, but these guys are living a very traditional lifestyle. They're out in the open air. The rest of their calories come from, I think, pork and from fish that they get out of the sea. Okay, that's the rest of their energy. Plus, yams originated in South and Central America. So they literally, the sweet potato didn't get there until a few hundred years ago. It was brought by the white fella on ships and traded, right? So, you know, this is not an ancestral diet for anybody, right? There is no group of human beings, because we didn't invent agriculture until 10,000 years ago at the very, very latest. Agriculture didn't hit England until 2,000 years ago. Julius Caesar wrote in his diary about agriculture being introduced to England by our Dutch friends, and it didn't reach Scotland until 1,500 years ago. So that's how recent these things are. So we've got to be very careful before saying, "Oh, look, these people have lived in the Amazon forever, and whatever they eat plants. Well, maybe they have to eat plants, you know, because the megafauna died out. So yeah, we just need to be careful not to conflate traditional diets from the Holocene with ancestral diets that we're eating for tens or hundreds of thousands of years before. So I forgot the question. Sorry.
Yeah. So the question is what's causing the massive amount of chronic disease these days?
Okay. We'll do the short answer. The short answer is massive toxicity from sugars and omega-6 fats, in my view, is the main thing. So we didn't have type 2 diabetes, heart disease. I mean, there was some diabetes in the 19th century. And yes, like you got people like Salisbury who cured it by putting people on a diet of steak. And Banting, for example, as well, cured his own corpulence, you know, with a similar thing. But we didn't have these things at the turn of the 20th century. And at the turn of the 20th century, just taking America, for example, 99% of the fats that people consumed in their diet were of animal origin. They were lard and tallow and probably, butter, cream, ghee, things like that. Some olive oil in the US, maybe some coconut oil, right? But it was all from the animal kingdom, right? The biggest thing now, the biggest the biggest switches that we've had in our diet is with the advent of hyper-processed food is, yes, our sugar consumption has gone up quite a lot, but I think dwarfed by that is the drop in animal fats. And animal fats are healthy. They contain the fat-soluble vitamins, which is Weston A. Price's conclusion about the fundamental trigger and cause of this thing. He said it's malnutrition. And he took people in his practice who were still eating sugar and gave them good quality butter and fish oil, and they reversed their dental caries, their cavities, the tooth decay. So it was, that suggests to us that it's actually the malnutrition part, and that when you consume a lot, I don't believe that sugar rots your teeth. I believe that lack of the fat soluble vitamins, that's what Weston Price showed us. So that is the biggest thing. We're not getting the fat soluble vitamins. There's A, D, and K, and D is arguably more of a hormone than a vitamin, but it is fat soluble. And the ones that your body needs come from the animal kingdom. You've got to get the right form of vitamin A. We don't want, is it beta carotene? We want retinol. And the same with vitamin K and whatever. Vitamin E, there are some sources of it in the plant kingdom, like wheat germ oil and stuff like that. But again, we're just missing out, and we're getting far too many omega-6s, which are inflammatory. And I'm way off being qualified to comment on the mechanisms of this massive breakdown that we're seeing, but you only have to look at what's changed in our diet. So it's to do with inflammation and oxidation, oxidative stress, and all of these. How all of these things work together, I don't know, and I think that there's a lot of far cleverer people trying to figure out exactly what those mechanisms are. But just from the outside, well, what have we changed? And that's what's changed.
Yeah, the other thing that's changed as well, up until the end of the First World War, we weren't really using much in the way of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, etc., etc. And then, of course, glyphosate also has been used for, I'm not sure how many years, 30, 40 years now.
Yeah, late 70s, glyphosate came out, which is also, by the way, Natasha Campbell-McBride has said that glyphosate is actually a broad-spectrum antibiotic. And so, what are we doing to our the microbiome in the gut when we're consuming grains and lots of grain-based stuff? And they're right. They say actually the active ingredient, it doesn't directly impact the pathway of human cells, and they're right. But dear listener, it might be a shock, but way less than 50% of your body is human cells. And you've got thousands of mitochondria on average in every cell per human cell in your body, and mitochondria are not human, and they have different DNA. They have their own DNA. They're actually of bacterial origin, so they're alien. And you have more bacterial cells in your digestive system than you have human cells in the entire rest of your body, by a factor of like 10. Right? So you are minority human. Right? You are actually a hot, wet bag of microbial slime, and you're beautiful with it, of course. but yeah, we're not even human. So, but the effect of glyphosate on the gut is very poorly understood at this point in time. And the other thing as well is that, I'm quite an expert on farming and the effect of farming on soils. To cut a very long story short, agriculture destroys soil. That's what it does. Monocropping And especially, I mean, we kind of figured out in the Middle Ages that you could, if you rotated your crops and you had like grew a crop one year, then you put animals on it the second year, on the third year, you leave it fallow. That's a basic 3-year rotation. That kept your soil pretty good. Okay. But the bottom line is that when you plow soil, you destroy it. And the simple fact is that our soils since the 1950s have lost half of their fertility, but also half of their mineral value as well. And so has the meat that we eat. That if the meat has been fed on agricultural products, the meat is also just lacking in the essential minerals that we need, which again just comes back to, like we say, there's two answers. It's malnutrition and toxicity, and that's the malnutrition part of it.
Yeah. I remember seeing a television program a few years back now, and it was a farming family, and they showed a picture from 1974, and the farmer was plowing the field, and at the time the daughter, who was now in charge of the farm, she was a little girl, and they were showing this video of the farmer. He was on his tractor, he's plowing the field, and as he's plowing the field, there was a huge amount of birds were just flocking to obviously eat whatever's being, disturbed in the soil. And then they showed her on a tractor plowing the same field, I don't know, 6 years ago. Not one bird was anywhere near there.
Because there's no earthworms.
Yeah,
that's basically the thing. But it's even worse than that. And we've been ploughing for 10,000 years. The ancient Egyptians had made pictures of ploughing, and they were from like 4,000 to 500 BC. But here's the problem in it, and it comes back to the fact that our lives are relatively short. And so are our memories, right? So we found out in the last 10,000 years, wherever you live in the world, that if you dragged a stick through the soil, I mean, first of all, you have to rip out all the trees and the bushes and the hedges and move the rocks and everything else to clear your space. But then if you disturb the soil and turn it over, then we found that it appeared that the soil became more fertile. Okay. And it does become more fertile, but in the short term. Because what happens when you plow, and now, by the way, they've got, 2,000 brake horsepower tractors that are dragging 18 plow blades at once. Okay. So we're doing, and GPS guided with a robot driving as well, not even a human. But what happens when you turn the soil is, so the soil in nature, at any time you see bare soil in nature, there's nothing growing by definition, right? Because it doesn't matter whether it's woodland or grassland and steppe or whatever, that soil is meant to be covered by protective skin of decomposing plant matter, right? Like leaf mold or whatever, which protects the soil itself from the elements, from UV light, from raindrops and oxygen. Now, when you plow, what happens is you turn that over. So you are scratching off the skin of Mother Earth and exposing the flesh underneath. And what happens is that, apart from the fact that you're slicing through snakes and rodents and worms and mycorrhizal networks, or the fungal networks under the ground, you're also exposing the bacteria and the microbes and all the other creepy crawlies, right? 1 billion per teaspoon. Okay. You're exposing these to oxygen, too much oxygen, and UV light and raindrops and stuff like that. So what happens is you get a massive die-off of the biome that's under the soil. Now, all these living things contain nitrogen. So what that happens is you then get light nitrogen leaching out into the soil. And when you plant your seeds, there's an abundance of nitrogen. So the plants grow and they appear to grow better, and they do grow better. But the problem is it comes at a great cost, because one of the most important things, apart from the biodiversity in the soil as well, the thing that makes soil dark is carbon. Carbon's got, like charcoal, very, very small particle size, which it means large surface area, which means it holds onto water really, really well. Okay. And when you turn it over, that carbon is exposed to the warmth and the oxygen. It then oxidizes and floats up into the air as CO2. Now, that's not a bad thing, because CO2 makes plants grow. But the problem is that your carbon in your soil is depleting every year. So what you end up with after a while is you get rain, the rain just runs off, taking any kind of remaining organic matter with it, and you end up with soil. You end up with baked clay or sand or whatever, and nothing will grow.
Mm.
But since the 50s, they've been kind of patching that problem by throwing artificial fertilizer that's derived from petrochemicals onto the ground to force stuff to grow. So you get plants that grow and it looks big and it looks healthy. But that's only because they force-fed it nitrogen. And the minerals just aren't there either. So you look at this thing that looks big and colorful and whatever, and it hasn't even got the nutrition in it that it would have done before. So yeah, plant agriculture is just a tragedy for human health from every angle that you look. Compare it to raising animals on pasture, which can actually physically build soil quicker than soil naturally develops in nature as well. So it's the opposite. So people say to me, well, can we feed 8 billion people on beef and lamb and stuff like that? And the answer, I think, actually is yes. We can feed 8 to 10 billion people on meat if we're smarter about it. And you can do things like you can have mob farming. You move your cattle from one bit to the next. We haven't got time to go into that, but then you can follow the cattle with chicken, for example. So you put chicken tractors in. Chicken's like nothing better than literally to go out finding a cow pat and to kick the crap out of the cow pat in search of parasitical worms and their eggs. So the chickens then kick the cow patties all over the place, which helps to build the soil and spread that stuff around. And then they are turning those parasites into chicken meat and eggs. Right. So, this is just smarter, but it's like whenever human beings try and improve on Mother Nature, we generally cock it up in a spectacular way. But we just look to nature. Nature makes things in many, many layers, and those layers interact. And then, of course, you've got you want to plant one species of plant because that's the economical way to do it, right? So you want to plant dwarf wheat in this field, so you destroy everything, right? And you create basically a desert where nothing can really grow apart from, if you look in nature, when you've got bare dirt. Right. And the only thing that grow are weeds, like dandelions, like annual grasses. Right. Now, these are annual plants that make lots of seeds and have very short roots and very small, low water requirement. So they're the only things that can grow, in like semi-desert, arid areas. Okay. And those happen to be the plants that we grow for our food. Okay. So you basically destroy an ecosystem. That's what a field is. It's ecocide. You have to kill almost everything so that you can plant the one species that you want. Very short roots, which means they don't go down very far, which means they're not pulling minerals up from the subsoil either. So they're only working in the first few inches of soil. And then you get this rapid growth, and then that makes lots of seeds, which means lots of calories for humans. We harvest that, and then we go back and do it again, and we do it again, and we do it again. And then a few generations later, there's no organic matter. There's no carbon left in the soil. And it doesn't matter how much nitrogen fertilizer you throw onto it, nothing's going to grow. They're crazy stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very sad situation that we're in. I remember seeing a guy in Africa. I'm sure you're going to know. I don't know the guy's name, but I'm guessing you're going to know who he is.
Alan Savory, probably.
He was the guy that took animals onto like desert land and he turned it back into fertile soil. And I think it is in your book, The Red Pill Food Revolution. You talk about the Sahara. Yeah,
the Sahara. Apparently in ancient Rome. So again, this is also just to pull up another reference. A guy called David R. Montgomery, a geologist, wrote a book called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, where he actually went back and realized that every ancient civilization, apart from the Egyptians, because they get fresh soil washed down from the Ethiopian plateau into the Nile Delta every year. So their civilization lasted 2,500 years. Every other ancient civilization, the Persians, the Mesopotamians, the Aztecs, Incas, ancient Greeks, all of them, every single one, every single great civilization emerged and then burnt itself out within around 500 years, up to maximum 1,000. Right? Every single time, every single one burnt itself out. And Montgomery's argument is that they did the reason that happened is because they destroyed their soil. You know, in this part of the world, in Europe, the agriculture was invented in what was called the Fertile Crescent, and that is now ranges from Egypt, Palestine, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Kuwait. Right now, we don't. When you think of those countries, you don't think you're rolling green hills. You think desert, and that's because that's what it does. So the Romans grew most of their grain and most of their olives in North Africa, which is the region we now call the Sahara Desert.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, not only have we got all that as well at the moment, and I don't want to go into too much detail on it, but we've also got, let's call it, the government actually trying to shut down farms completely and turn them into, wind factories or solar factories, or but that's a whole nother can of worms for another day. So why do you think society promotes a plant-based diet? What's your view on that? Hey Rebels, did you know I now produce an exclusive No Punches Pulled episode every month? These episodes feature controversial guests who aren't afraid to expose lies, share stories of being gaslit or cancelled, and provide real-world solutions for achieving optimal health and maintaining your freedom. These are the kind of episodes that got me cancelled back in 2022, booted off Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and even deplatformed from LinkedIn. But I'm still here, and these powerful episodes are available exclusive for subscribers only. For the price of just one takeaway coffee per month, you'll gain access to content the authorities don't want you to hear. By subscribing, you're not just supporting the Radical Health Rebel podcast, you're joining the fight for uncensored truth, education, and inspiration. It's easy to sign up. Just head to the show notes, click support the show, and follow their instructions. Prefer watching your podcasts? You can also subscribe on Substack by searching Radical Health Rebel. There you'll also receive weekly articles and more, all for the same low price. Let's rebel against censorship and the lies of mainstream media. Together, we can build a healthier, fairer, and freer world. Thanks for your support, and let's keep rebelling.
Great question. The truth is, of why I think that, is because it makes humans dependent, weak, and unhealthy and subservient. So, I believe that our society post-agriculture runs on for the benefit of a very small minority of psychopaths. That before agriculture, there wouldn't have been room for psychopaths in human tribal societies, and they certainly wouldn't have been able to flourish. Whereas since we moved to agriculture and our communities got too big for everyone to know everyone and trust everyone, that actually created the perfect breeding ground for the psychopath. And all of this is covered in the Red Pill Food Revolution. If you want to go out and buy a copy of that, please do. I think it's one of the best books on health, food and health ever written, but I would say that because I wrote it. But yeah, we created the ideal breeding ground for the psychopath, and and slaves have always been fed on cheap food, grains. It makes us unhealthy, which means we also need to buy pharmaceuticals, which happen to be owned by the same companies, if you really look into it, as own the big food as well. So it's unhealthy. It's also addictive. People are addicted to carbohydrates. They trigger the opioid receptors and different pathways in your brain. Sugar and wheat are like cocaine and heroin to the brain. Sugar is I would say even more addictive than cocaine. Very
Candace Pert said that sugar is more addictive than heroin.
Yeah,
and she got the Nobel Prize for finding the opiate receptor.
Wow.
So she agrees with you on that, or at least she did when she was alive.
Yeah. And you have to eat multiple times a day. People have always fed their slaves on gruel. And it makes us dependent. You get upset and hungry. I used to get really hungry, and I was like vegetarian in my early 20s. And if I didn't go, if I went more than a couple of hours without putting something grain-based in my face, then I would become upset and irritable and depressed and want to cry. And it's crazy. And what they don't want is a society of strong people who know their own minds, who and who aren't dependent on pharmaceutical drugs and aren't dependent on eating all the time, who are prepared to stand there and go, no, I'm not going to be pushed around like this, and simply because there's a lot more of us than there are of them, and they need us not to be able to look up and see how badly we're being screwed all the time, So we need to be constantly worrying about our existence. That's the honest answer, Lee. That's it.
Yeah,
and that's the conclusion that we come to in the Red Pill Food Revolution. But then we, in the last 3 chapters of that book, we do say it's not too late. It's just not too late. But things are getting really, really scary right now with the war against the farmers. We're seeing it now with the last budget in the UK. The Irish have been dealing with that for a long time. The Irish farmers are now being paid to destroy their cattle. In Denmark, I think they're now looking at a tax on cattle for their burps, for the methane, which is absolute nonsense because methane breaks down into CO2 over a few years anyway. And by the way, there's always more biomass of large ruminants in the world than there are today anyway. And the world didn't choke to death. We know this, because life has flourished on Earth for millions of years. It hasn't choked to death before. And the reality is that we're actually coming out of a very, very cold period. We're on the long-term cycle. We're in the absolute minimum of global temperatures. Life has flourished on Earth for hundreds of millions of years, during which we've had highs, lows. We're in a very deep low now, and we're also in a very, very almost rock bottom for CO2, atmospheric CO2. So if the CO2 in the air dropped much more than it is now, it would be the end of large life on Earth because the plants would die. There just wouldn't be enough carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a whole nother picture.
So my final question for you, and it's a bit of a double question. So we know that eating plants and vegetarianism and even veganism is kind of being pushed, and we're being told it's the healthy thing and it's the spiritual thing and all this kind of stuff. But my question is, what would you say to someone who thinks that eating vegetarian or vegan, is a spiritual thing, or, and again, I hear this a lot, and I don't have an issue with it. Everyone's going to have their own values. But I hear a lot of people say that I'm an animal lover and therefore I won't eat animals. What's your take on those two questions?
Yeah. This is something that I think about a lot. I think our society wants us to act like herbivores because it also wants us to think like herbivores as well. If you look at the difference, I've got a Substack called Way of the Carnivore.substack.com where I've got, if you look back through there, I've got a lot of videos and discussions about the difference in this mindset. But herbivores' lives are dominated by mild panic, right? Which is also the way that our society appears to want us to behave. Constantly afraid of global warming, climate change, acid rain, the latest virus or pandemic or whatever it is, nuclear war, AIDS, Zika. Well, take your pick. Constantly afraid, and people who are afraid don't think properly. You go back into a reptilian limbic system, and you search for protection and cover from the authorities, from your tribe, but in this case, government. So, I think that just hold the thought that that's how they want you to think. They don't want you to go out into the world knowing that you're the scariest thing out there, knowing your power, and going out and seizing what it is that you really want. They want you just to shrink back into the herd and go, oh, I'm glad it's not me. I'm glad it's not me that's getting eaten, right? Very, very different mindset. Anyway, but that's not really the point. Is it the ethical and spiritual thing to avoid eating animals? Completely the opposite. Just go back to what I was saying about agriculture and what happens. It's ecocide, right? Even just mathematically, death is not the opposite of life. For everything that lives, there is always going to be one death at some point. Right? It doesn't matter what it is, plant, animal, microbe, whatever. Okay, always going to be one death. So the more life that we have going on Earth, the more deaths there are going to be. So the minimization of death is not only not the goal, we should avoid at all costs the minimization of death, because if you aim for the minimization of death, what you get is the minimization of life as well. So if you love life, then you should not be afraid of death, because the two are just opposite sides of the same coin. So what is the opposite of life? Well, if you want to know what the opposite of life is, you go and stand in a field, right, at any time of year, and look for where the life is at, because you can't see it. Right? Now, you go onto pasture where there's animals grazing, billions of lives in every teaspoon of soil. There are dozens and dozens of species growing, even on the ground, below the ground, right? You've got birds, you've got insects, you've got everything, right? And all of this is tied together because that's how nature works, multiple levels of beautiful complexity. Now, human beings come along and go, no, you shouldn't have that because of farts, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make fields, and we're going to make soy, and we're going to make fake meat in labs that you can eat and whatever, right? So you kill everything. The opposite of life is lifelessness. The opposite of an ecosystem is a desert. And agriculture makes deserts. That's what it does. Right? If you look up the succession of plants, how plants grow, you get bare dead soil. You get like arid, semi-arid situation, which would just be plain sand or silt or clay. You get these pioneer annual plants that go there. They're little seeds that just wait there until it rains. Then it rains, and they put out little short roots, right? And they grow, and they make more seeds, and they go poof, and the seeds go off. Okay. Now, what happens is then that plant dies, decays into the soil, adds a little bit of carbon into the soil, and then other plants can come along. Plants that live for a couple of years, right? Put down slightly deeper roots. Okay, so then you get your perennial grasses, and you get your shrubs and your bushes and your small trees, and eventually big trees and woodlands. And then there's a natural disaster. There's a forest fire, there's a volcano, there's a mudslide, there's something that wipes out the thing. You reset back to factory settings, and you have to start all over again with your weeds. Okay, that's what agriculture does. But so what agriculture does is twice a year they just slam this big red button that goes natural disaster. Right. And the natural disaster is what we do. We go and plow it. We destroy everything. Right. Never mind. And we haven't even got to talking about the absolute infestations we get of insects. When you only plant one thing in a field, right? It's a stupid idea, because nature's meant everything protects everything else. Right. Anyway, that we haven't even got time to get into that one. But you destroy all the life. You destroy an ecosystem in order to plant one thing. Soybeans, dwarf wheat, whatever it may be, corn, and just go and stand in a field and find out for yourself. It's an illusion. It's a fairy tale. You cannot avoid death. And yes, plowing causes way more deaths than eating beef and lamb. Way more deaths. You can't even count the difference, right? You destroy everything. But again, that isn't the point. The point is that there are different ways that we can get our food, and some of them work with nature's laws to maintain complex beautiful, multi-layered ecosystems, and some of those go out of their way deliberately to destroy those ecosystems, right? Yes, I completely agree that factory farming, that keeping pigs in small containers, that keeping chickens under artificial light so that they'll lay all, 24/7, that is absolutely abhorrent and has no place in a civilized society. But the way that we're going to change that is by going out and buying the best bacon, the best beef, and the best eggs and the best chicken, if that's what you want, right? Don't buy farmed fish, buy the natural fish. Use your economic power. We are the majority, right? We don't have to succumb to what the corporations are telling us that we're going to be eating. We don't have to agree with the psychopath clowns who say in 2030 you will eat much less meat for your health and for our planet, right? You will own nothing and be happy. We get to say no to that. There's this thing called the Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution. Right? I'll just finish on this, right? And just bear it in mind that the problems come from them. A very, very small number of people who might meet once a year in Switzerland, okay? They come up with these problems. They give us these problems. The television tells us these problems. It's not the evidence of your senses. Right. So, I mean, in my lifetime, I grew up with nuclear war, AIDS and whatever since. They're all invisible and they don't respect borders. They give us the solution. The solution happens to be the dissolution of national representative democracies. If you look at the rhetoric, they're all saying that national governments are not up to the task of dealing with these global threats that we face now. But there's this thing in the middle, right? And their solution is a one world government, right? And their solution is us all moving into these megacities, move off the land into the cities, eat the bugs, all of that. But what's the R bit? Problem, reaction, solution. We have to react. It's like a pantomime out there, right? Oh, no, it isn't. Oh, yes, it is, we have to react. Why do we have to react? Well, the answer is actually very simple. The answer is that we have the power. That these psychos cannot impose their new world order onto us. Because we are the 99.99%, we have to demand it. So they give us, like the Wizard of Oz, they give us this illusion of threat. And we all have to turn around and say to them, please, Uncle Bill or Uncle Klaus or whatever your name might be, right? Please give us your new world solution to this because we're so scared. And then they go, all right, seeing as you insist, we will impose this technocracy. So that you go into your local supermarket and you try and pay for your ribeye steak and it says declined because you've exceeded your personal carbon allowance for that month. It's like, but at least we're protected, and the world isn't going to come to an end due to climate change. And that's it. So all we have to do is have faith, be strong, trust nature, trust natural law, trust your own body that knows how to heal itself. Trust the natural world that knows how to feed itself, and not be afraid. That's where it starts.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things to that. So I interviewed Jane Buxton, who wrote the book The Great Plant-Based Con.
Yep.
And she was telling me she interviewed a farmer from California. He was an avocado farmer. And he said he would have to kill 40,000 gophers every year to protect his crop.
Yeah.
Right? What's the symbol of veganism? It's the avocado, right?
Yeah.
And most people just don't know this. And I mean, I have mentioned this to people before, or not necessarily that example, but like you said, just plowing fields kills far more animals than livestock farming. But then they come up with an excuse to kind of match their belief system, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And the other thing I would just say from a spiritual point of view, some of the most spiritual people that have ever lived were the native Indians. What did they eat predominantly?
Yeah. Hunted the buffalo.
Buffalo and bison, right? So, yeah, it's interesting. So, Ben, what's next for you?
Oh, well, gosh. So yeah, I'm working on a book in the background right now, but can't talk about that. And I'm going to be moving into just more kind of consulting with people as well. So for me, it feels like I've got this kind of ADD personality that I can't keep my attention on one thing for very long. I also ran a conference called Keto Brain Health with my partner Heather this October. That was in Manchester. So we ran the first one of those, and that was amazing. So we had Dr. Zoe Harcum, Richard Smith, Anthony Chafee, Ivor Cummins was there, and Dr. Rachel Brown, the UK's metabolic psychiatrist, metabolic shrink. Lovely event there. So we're gonna carry on doing that, Keto Brain Health, because that's one of those other. I mean, we've talked about general healthy, but we didn't even get into the mental health pandemic that's going on in the world today, and even without getting into other kind of chemicals that may be finding their ways into people's bodies, the impact of diet on the brain is enormous as well. But we'll leave that one for another time.
Well, and there's a lot of connection between the gut and the brain, isn't there? And mental health issues, there's quite a connection between the gut and the brain and the vagus nerve.
Massively. Yeah. And I mean, Natasha Campbell-McBride, has been talking about that for years. But again, it's one of those areas that we're only just, it's the connectedness of all things, isn't it? Our medicine systems and our food systems have been so focused and intent on pigeonholing and splitting things up, for so many years. But the reality is that everything's connected. We're all dependent on each other, everything like that. So, it's insanity to try and pretend that we're not a part of this whole system. But if anyone's interested in the brain health side of things, please go along to ketobrainhealth.co.uk, and you can download the recordings of the sessions from there as well. And that would support us and help us to run a future conference as well.
Brilliant. And where else can people find you online, and where can people find your books?
Yeah, well, just search for Red Pill Food Revolution. That's the main thing. If you read one book in 2025, let it be that one. You can buy it from all good and evil online booksellers. So it's widely available. Yeah, please buy it and read it. That's all I would ask. It's I think it's a fantastic book. Yeah,
it is a fantastic book. Yeah, I read it quite recently. I always like it when a book's really informative, but also really easy to read. And I just found it so easy to read and just very informative. And so I tend to read for an hour before I go to sleep at night. And every day I was looking forward to reading your book. So can't give it better praise than that, really.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that.
No problem. Ben, thank you so much for your time today. And this has been a great conversation. And you've shared some real great information, for the listeners to tuck into. So thanks very much.
Yeah, much appreciated. Thanks for having me on.
It's been a pleasure. So that's all from Ben and me for this week. But don't forget to join me same time, same place next week on the Radical Health Rebel podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to give the show a rating and a review, and I'll see you next time.